On the show today, Israel declares war on Hamas.
Israel continued pounding targets in Gaza on Sunday in retaliation for a surprise incursion on its territory a day earlier by the militant group Hamas.
Plus, the UN Security Council meets. VOA is there.
I think what we heard from diplomats is, while peace talks could be down the line, they're just really not on the horizon right now. Right now it's about Israel regaining its sovereignty over its territory and rescuing its citizens.
And later, a look at the devastation in Afghanistan following multiple earthquakes, and a look at the special role of female teachers in Zambia. Today is Monday, October 9th, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. On Saturday morning, Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel, firing hundreds of missiles, invading villages and military bases, as well as murdering civilians and taking hostages. At least 700 Israelis have been killed, with thousands injured. Israel retaliated swiftly, attacking Hamas command centers in Gaza, as well as engaging with militants on the battlefield. Hundreds of Palestinians have also been killed, and a hospital and mosque were damaged by shelling. The UN Security Council met Sunday evening in New York to discuss the ongoing situation. We'll hear from VOA's UN correspondent in a few minutes. Up first, though, the reaction in Washington has also been swift. U.S. President Joe Biden has directed additional support for Israel following the surprise attack. Here's VOA's Veronica Balderas-Iglesias with more on efforts to de-escalate tensions.
As its cabinet confirmed a declaration of war, Israel continued pounding targets in Gaza on Sunday in retaliation for a surprise incursion on its territory a day earlier by the militant group Hamas. The U.S. Embassy in Israel warned American citizens that the situation continues to be unpredictable. But Washington continues its efforts to de-escalate it, said Secretary of State Antony Blinken during an appearance on ABC's This Week show.
I was on the phone with the Israeli president, the foreign minister. The entire government has been engaged throughout the region and well beyond, both to build support for Israel and to make sure that every country was using whatever means it has, whatever influence it has, to pull Hamas back, and also to make sure that we don't see conflict erupt in other areas.
Already, more than 20,000 people have sought shelter in schools run by the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Meanwhile, relatives of Israeli civilians allegedly being held hostage by Hamas visited police stations to provide DNA samples that could aid the investigations. Washington has also been working on verifying reports that Americans are among those killed or are being held hostage by Hamas. U.S. Secretary Antony Blinken.
Any American anywhere who's being detained or held hostage, that is going to be a priority for this government, for this administration.
Details on how the surprise attack on Israel was conducted are still slow in coming. But Republican presidential candidate and former UN ambassador Nikki Haley said the U.S. can't afford not to pay close attention, even in the middle of its own political challenges.
America needs to wake up. We need to put this negativity and division behind us, and we need to focus on national security for ourselves and for our friends.
Republican Representative Matt Gaetz, who recently succeeded at ousting House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, appeared on NBC's Meet the Press. He expressed optimism that the subsequent congressional political vacuum that some worry could delay aid packages for Israel will be filled in the near future.
I think we're actually going to come together quite soon. I think we've got two great choices.
For its part, the White House announced that President Joe Biden has directed additional support for Israel and will remain in close contact with the Israeli government. Veronica Balderas-Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
The Israeli army said it was working Sunday to clear out Hamas fighters who remained in the country a day after their surprise attack on Israel. VOA's Steve Miller spoke with Libby Weiss. She's a major in reserve and spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces.
The world woke up to the news of the Hamas attack on Saturday morning. You're there in Israel. What was it like as the events were unfolding?
it was truly a nightmare. I don't know that there is another way to describe what the entire country saw and what the entire country was experiencing. I mean, this is the worst massacre of Israeli civilians in Israel's history. And to watch Hamas terrorists invade the country, truly butcher men, women, children, the elderly on the streets of Israel, see them drag civilians into the Gaza Strip, the hostage situations that were taking place in Israeli communities along the southern border yesterday and that have continued to today. It's truly horrific. It's a nightmare for us on an individual level and certainly as a nation.
You describe this nightmare situation, the horrific visuals that have been playing out on television screens and video screens throughout the world. What is, I guess, a day and a half later, what are people, experiencing and expressing in the streets throughout Israel?
There's incredible devastation on one hand, of course, of the magnitude of the loss. And they're also within the military, there's a focus at this stage on really securing the southern border with Gaza, making sure that Israeli civilian communities are protected. The military has now started evacuating civilians living along the border with the Gaza Strip to remove them from the danger that's taking place. And looking down the road, really the focus will be on making sure that Hamas does not have the military capabilities of doing this again. And I think that we all understand that that is an absolutely necessary step and something that in any country would be the expectation of the military at this stage.
You're a major in the reserves, and Prime Minister Netanyahu said that reservists would be called up. So how is that taking place?
Well, it's already started. So reservists have been called in. Really, the entire military is operational at this stage. So reservists have been called in across all different units within the military. It's very much a national mission at this stage. And people really feel that they're fighting for their homes. When we see Hamas terrorists slaughter people on the streets and we see them take hostages in civilian communities within Israel, then there's, I think, no greater sense that everybody is fighting for their home, fighting to defend their families and their loved ones. And we're really seeing that in the last 36 hours, nearly 36 hours.
Major in Reserve Libby Weiss is a spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Forces. Major Weiss, thank you very much for your time.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
The Hamas attack on Saturday took not only Israel, but the whole world by surprise. The UN Security Council met to discuss the situation on Sunday evening. VOA's Margaret Bashir was there.
So it was a closed-door meeting. It was just the 15 council members. Israel and the Palestinian ambassador were not invited. They were there to discuss the situation. They were briefed by Tor Venesland, who's the UN's Middle East Peace Process Special Coordinator. He gave them a very grim briefing from what we hear. And basically, council members condemned what's happening in Israel, Hamas's attacks. And there was no formal statement from the council. Usually you would see some sort of a statement. It takes all 15 to agree it. There must be unity. What we heard from diplomats afterwards is that most council members, were condemning, not everyone, and no formal statement was put forward.
A Security Council meeting aside, I understand there were individual ambassadors as well outside, including from Israel and the Palestinian side. Can you tell us what they had to say?
Sure. Well, Israel's ambassador was, understandably upset. He came and told reporters that this was Israel's 9/11, reference to the al-Qaeda terrorist attacks on the United States in 2001 that killed nearly 3,000 people. I mean, we know hundreds of Israelis have been killed, injured, or kidnapped by Hamas on Saturday. He said from now on, nothing will be as it was. And he called what Hamas has done war crimes, and he said they must be unequivocally condemned by the Security Council. We also heard from the Palestinian ambassador, Riyad Mansour, he said that the Palestinian Authority has requested an emergency meeting of the Arab League at the foreign minister level later this week in Cairo. And, he said, look, the Palestinian people have endured one deadly year after another under Israeli occupation. And Israel cannot wage a war against these people, their land, their holy sites, and expect peace in exchange. And he said there is a way for a different path where neither Palestinians or Israelis are killed. And he did urge peace. But I think what we heard from diplomats is, while peace talks could be down the line, they're just really not on the horizon right now. Right now, it's about Israel regaining its sovereignty over its territory and rescuing its citizens.
Now, Margaret, I know it's a busy day at the UN. I know the Security Council meeting wasn't public. What's next? Will there be more public meetings? Will the General Assembly discuss this? Are there plans for more discussions or possibly some action as we go forward?
Well, I think all of those are possible. We just have to see where it's a fluid situation. We just have to see where the situation goes on the ground, where the UN and the UN Security Council can be useful if they pronounce on it. It's only useful if it makes a good difference, right? So they need to see what they can do. But honestly, the Security Council is a bit limited in its tools at the moment. And, the Secretary General has called for restraint, for calm, for release of the hostages. So has Mr. Venneslan, his Middle East envoy. But until parties are ready to hear that, I think we're going to see a continuation of the ground war. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu said this weekend that it would be a long war.
VOA's Margaret Bashir is at the United Nations in New York. Margaret, thank you for your reporting on this.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
And here's more stories we're following from around the world. A delegation of U.S. lawmakers led by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer arrived in China on Saturday. It's the first congressional visit to the country since 2019. The trip comes amid sharp deterioration in relations between the two countries and as Chinese and U.S. officials try to lay the groundwork for a possible meeting between Presidents Joe Biden and Xi Jinping in November. On Sunday, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey inaugurated the first church built with government backing in the overwhelmingly Muslim country's 100-year history as a post-Ottoman state. Previously, Erdogan drew condemnation for converting ancient churches into mosques and making Islamic conservatism into a leading social force. And South Sudan's government on Friday admitted to having censored the media and removing articles it deemed to incite hatred after a UN-backed inquiry detailed pervasive restrictions on free press in the troubled country. More than 2,000 people have died in western Afghanistan following earthquakes and aftershocks. The UN says hundreds of homes have been destroyed. As VOA's Arash Arabasadi reports, those numbers are expected to rise.
Rescuers pull a living child from under debris following multiple 6.3 magnitude earthquakes that struck Afghanistan on Saturday. It was a bright moment on an otherwise solemn day that one Taliban official said resulted in more than 2,000 deaths and more than 9,000 injuries. Mullah Janan Saik, Taliban spokesperson of the disaster ministry, speaking at a news conference in Kabul as provided by Reuters.
We have tried our best to treat victims. 10 rescue teams have been formed from different national and international institutions, in addition to the evacuation and rescue operations. The blood distribution process is going on too, and water and shelter have been provided for people in the district.
According to CBS News, the Taliban expect the death toll to rise. Families have taken to sleeping in the streets away from structures that could collapse at any moment. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says the earthquake affected 8 villages and destroyed more than 1,300 homes. Despite official claims of delivering aid for some now living outside, little has come their way. Area resident Nek Mohammed speaking with AFP.
We came home and we saw there was nothing left. Everything had turned to sand. We started to work with shovels and whatever we had to take out the women and children from the rubble. We have 20 to 30 people who died. We have nothing, no blankets or anything else.
Afghanistan is a mountainous country prone to earthquakes. According to the Reuters news agency, diplomats and aid officials say the ruling Taliban's strict restrictions on women and human rights in general have led to donors and aid agencies backing out of the country. The Washington Post reports first responders compared the damage of these recent quakes to one from 2022 that killed at least 1,000 people, one of the deadliest natural disasters in Afghanistan in decades. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
From Washington, it's VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Karish. Coming up on the program, a look at native languages in the United States. But first, in recent years, UNICEF and UNESCO reports have emphasized that female teachers are making a big difference when it comes to educating girls in Africa. VOA visited Lusaka, Zambia, to see the impact they're having there. Kathy Short filed this story.
Josephine Mwaba has been a teacher for 22 years. She teaches biology at Lusaka's Kablonga Girls Secondary School. Mwaba says her students love learning, but the young girls here face challenges.
So the challenges are that girls fall pregnant, and sometimes they get married at an early stage. But being a female teacher, I encourage them not to get married early, not to fall pregnant, but to concentrate on school. Because only when they get educated, then they'll be able to make proper decisions and live an independent life.
Rebecca Kaira is a student at the school, one of the many taught by female teachers like Mwaba.
Female teachers mostly encourage us girls because they act as mothers as we are here at school. So they mostly encourage us girls to focus on education.
According to Zambia's Teaching Service Commission, or TSC, there are more than 190,000 teachers in the country, but at least 150,000 more are needed to ensure quality and effective education. The TSC is a government body in charge of human resources, policy guidance, accreditation and validation of teachers' qualifications. Sonakshi Sharma, an education research specialist at UNICEF Innocenti Global Office of Research and Foresight, works on the organization's Women in Learning Leadership Research. Sharma says evidence shows that for girls, female teachers play a positive role in learning.
So school leadership is an important vector to enhance student learning because they play a critical role in creating a high-quality teaching and learning environment within schools, and this can contribute to overall student learning outcomes and well-being.
The Basic Education Teachers Union of Zambia, which represents teachers in the public service in the country, says female teachers are driving forces in Zambia's education system. One of the country's biggest challenges is serving students in rural areas. Another is paying teachers what they deserve, says Mwangala Mulako, the union's director of gender-related issues.
We have more of women presentation in our union than the male. And then these teachers, most of them, the women that we have, they have upgraded themselves. What I mean is they've feathered in their studies from maybe a certificate holder to a diploma holder or a degree holder, even as far as masters in different fields of education. So the situation which is there is they're all crying for an upgrade. They need to be moved from the lower salary scales to higher salary scales.
According to UNICEF, African countries, including Zambia, are facing the world's worst teacher shortage. The continent still needs 17 million more teachers if it is to achieve universal primary and secondary education by 2030, and more female teachers are needed now more than ever. Kathy Short for VOA News, Lusaka, Zambia.
And finally today, Monday in the United States will be celebrated as Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. When Christopher Columbus made contact with the native inhabitants in the Caribbean in 1492, there were more than 500 languages spoken across the Americas. In the land that became the United States, the remaining number of such languages has dwindled to about 100. Most now only have a handful of speakers. The story from VOA's chief national correspondent, Steve Herman.
Alex Fire Thunder in South Dakota is teaching his two young boys the Lakota language because he wants them to have a strong sense of their Oglala Lakota nation identity.
Language is everything. That's something that nobody can take away from them.
Fire Thunder is optimistic his sons, ages 3 and 2, along with a newborn daughter, will have others besides themselves to converse in Lakota when they grow up.
There's immersion schools, there are other second language learners learning the language and teaching their children.
That was not the case for decades.
My mom is a speaker, but she didn't transmit the language to my siblings and I.
Native American children in North America for generations were sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their own languages and were immersed in American culture. The chairman of the Language Conservancy, Wilhelm Maya, says that had a devastating effect.
There's only about 10 to 15 languages left in the U.S. that have any viable chances in terms of moving forward beyond the next 50 years.
When the languages lose their last fluent speakers, it can also mean the demise of their indigenous songs and prayers, explains Maya.
In the U.S. right now, the average speaker age is about 75 years old. The children are, for the most part, not learning the language. So there's a lot to do in order to try to get these languages back on their feet.
Hundreds of indigenous linguists, educators, and scholars are to gather this week for a conference in Bloomington, Indiana, to share knowledge and inspire language revitalization efforts. Steve Herman, VOA News.
And that's going to wrap it up for us today. This has been International Edition on the Voice of America. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thanks for joining us. For pictures, stories, videos, and more, follow VOA News on your favorite social media platform and online at voanews.com. Until next time, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Stay safe and have a great day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
Over 2.5 years ago, the military seized power in Burma in a bloody coup. The regime has left Burma in ruins, with 4 out of 5 townships affected by armed clashes between the military and those that oppose its rule. The results have been devastating, said USAID Deputy Administrator Michael Schiffer in recent congressional testimony.
Today, due to the military's brutality, there are over 1.9 million people displaced in Burma and nearly 1 million refugees in Bangladesh and Thailand. The internally displaced communities are facing increased threats of violence from the military and facing ongoing trauma due to a conflict, a bungled COVID response, epic mismanagement of the economy, high food prices, and frequent displacement that has severely impacted the coping mechanisms of the internally displaced communities.
Through USAID, the United States has led the international community's humanitarian response to Burma and the Rohingya refugee crisis in Bangladesh by providing nearly $2.1 billion since 2017, said Deputy Administrator Schiffer.
We deliver humanitarian assistance to the displaced, conflict-afflicted, and other vulnerable groups by leveraging our partnerships with humanitarian organizations that deliver assistance to beneficiaries based on verifiable need.
And although at times this work has required engagement with governing authorities in Burma, said Deputy Administrator Schiffer, we do so with humanitarian principles first and foremost in mind. In Bangladesh, USAID supports emergency preparedness and response capacity of host communities in Cox's Bazar district, including funding for humanitarian coordination, nutrition, protection, and risk management. USAID also provides emergency support to pro-democracy activists and ethnic support organizations, civil society leaders, journalists, and human rights defenders, explained Deputy Administrator Schiffer. This ongoing assistance provides a critical safety net and includes temporary safe houses, subsistence living expenses, emergency medical needs, digital and physical security, legal aid, and psychosocial support, enabling individuals and entities to continue their work for a democratic future for Burma. The road ahead in Burma remains challenging, warned Deputy Administrator Schiffer. Nevertheless, USAID remains committed to provide the people of Burma with the support they need during this crisis, prioritizing humanitarian assistance, civilian protection, including early warning and early response, and support for the development and growth of governance institutions to advance U.S. policy objectives of a just, peaceful, inclusive, federal, and democratic Burma.
That was an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
Ukraine expresses solidarity for Israel following deadly weekend attacks.
Ukrainians understand very precisely what's happening in Israel and how Israeli people feel at this point.
Plus, with Congress in turmoil, U.S. aid for Ukraine is still in limbo.
I think the drip-by-drip approach that we've used has been very damaging. It has drawn out the war. It has caused greater loss of life. It has given the Russians time to build these massive defenses in the south that they have built.
And later in the program, the growing humanitarian crisis in Ukraine worsening by the day as Russia ramps up its assaults on civilian targets. Today is Monday, October 9th. From the Voice of America, this is Flashpoint Ukraine. Good evening. I'm Lori London in Washington. Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, flashed Israel's national flag on advertising boards on Sunday, signaling support after a surprise Hamas attack on Israel that was unraveling into full-scale violence in the region. This as Ukraine itself saw another weekend of Russian bombardment in a number of regions. I talked to Anna Chernikova in Kyiv for an update on all of it.
Russian forces continue shelling of the Ukrainian cities, and over the weekend, we have reports from Zaporizhia, Odessa, and Kherson region, with most of the shelling happening there. What's important to mention that Russian forces used Onyx missiles to attack Odessa. Onyx missiles were previously used once as well, but these missiles normally are not used for on-land attacks. From Odessa, we know about 4 victims and the heat at the recreation facility, as well as damages of the grain storage in private buildings. In the Zaporizhia region, 5 private buildings were damaged, with 1 local resident killed and 2 injured. In the Zaporizhia region, Russian forces used cluster munitions to launch their attack over the weekend. And Kherson region, again, was under the fire. We know about 11 people injured, including a 9-month-old baby and a medical worker of the Red Cross. On Sunday morning, during the morning service, one of the cathedrals in Kherson was under Russian attack as well. There are damages of the cathedral facilities, and 2 people were reported injured. This is one of the big cathedrals in the city.
And with all of this happening, and now a lot of the media attention has been turning to Israel with what has been happening there with the Hamas attack over the weekend. At the same time, I understand that Ukraine is keeping a close eye on this. President Zelensky has shown his support for Israel. He spoke to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I understand there may be Ukrainian officials seem to think there may be some connection to the Hamas terrorists in Russia.
This is actually true, and this was discussed here in Ukraine a lot, that Ukraine definitely sees Russian role in this recent escalation of war in Israel. And what's important, what the main aim, according to Ukrainian experts and Ukrainian politics, is basically Russia is trying to turn world's attention away from Ukraine. A similar opinion actually was also expressed by President of Poland and in the recent report by the Institute for the Study of War, as well as there are also talks about Russian military support of Hamas and Iranian support as well. But again, this we cannot discuss. It was no official reports on that at this point. However, Ukrainian Ministry of Defense reports that Russia handed over to Hamas trophy weapons captured during hostilities here in Ukraine, which were manufactured in the US and EU. And according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, Russia plans to launch a disinformation campaign to accuse the Ukrainian military of selling these Western weapons to the terrorist organization. And this is something that was discussed today. We can also say that for Ukraine, this escalation in Israel has a very important angle because a lot of Ukrainians are living in Israel, and a lot of Ukrainians were going to Israel when full-scale invasion happened. So basically, they are refugees to Israel. And at this point, there are reports of at least 2 Ukrainians killed during this latest escalation in Israel.
And I understand there are billboards and flags.
Actually, on Sunday in Kyiv, particularly, all electronic billboards were representing support to Israel with Israeli flags on it. And this was in a cooperation with local authorities. So Kyiv is definitely showing its support to the people of Israel. Ukrainians understand very precisely what's happening in Israel and how Israeli people feel at this point. So we'll see what the next day will bring us.
Anna Chernikova reporting for VOA from Kyiv. Congress's failure to include aid for Ukraine in a recent continuing resolution to fund the U.S. government has raised concern about future support for Ukraine's ability to defend itself from Russia's invasion. Now, with aid also promised to Israel following the deadly weekend attacks by Hamas militants, will that further complicate efforts to support Ukraine? I spoke with Ambassador Kurt Volker, a distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He served as U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations from 2017 through 2019 and as the former U.S. Ambassador to NATO.
A lot of concern over future funding for Ukraine from Democrats, from the Republican, from European allies, given that the continuing resolution on September 30th that kept the U.S. government open left out aid for Ukraine. It was literally the reason that it was being held up by a small group of Republicans in Congress. Now, we know the bill was only temporary, so the debate will be back up again in a couple of weeks. And it seems that there's a lot of uncertainty as to what happens if we don't provide funding for Ukraine. What happens to our relationship with our allies? What happens to Ukraine? What happens with our own national security? What is your perspective on this?
I think everyone is obviously watching this, but even in all the things that you just listed, there are a number of positive things. First off, I think it was helpful to pass a clean continuing resolution and take Ukraine aid out of that, because the overall issues on the budget are very controversial. And also the way that this was passed, which was overruling the far-right minority in the Republican Party, which then caused this rebellion against McCarthy. All of those things were happening on their own, independent of aid to Ukraine. And I think that's useful because now we're going to have a situation where they come back to pass a regular budget, even if it's another continuing resolution. They're going to have to choose a new speaker. That will probably result in a change of this rule that only one member is required to file a motion to vacate. And as a result of all that, I think then you can come back to voting on Ukraine aid, and it has a better chance of passing as a standalone item. And you have to remember as well that in both the Senate and the House, you have vast majorities in both parties that support aid to Ukraine. The trick is getting it to the floor.
Without a House Speaker, there won't be a vote.
That's right. And I think they will get a speaker. Their first votes to do so will be tomorrow, but it's probably not going to go in one round. They're probably going to have a lot of negotiation over this. But I think there will be a speaker eventually. It will be a Republican. It will somehow adjust the rules that led to this crisis to begin with. I don't think they're going to tee it up so that this could happen all over again.
But some of the hardliners are saying that they don't want money going to Ukraine, period. Not just, they want it to go to the U.S. border security. They're just sort of digging in. Going to be able to overcome that. And what happens if we don't support Ukraine?
You're absolutely right that there are some people with that view. And it is also right that many, many more people want to see more attention to the southern border. They're not incompatible, helping Ukraine and helping get control of our southern border, that you can do both. And as far as the votes go, there's only a dozen or so people who take that very hardline view against aid to Ukraine. The vast majority of all the representatives are in favor. There are these hardliners, but they only have a dozen or so vote. It would be very odd for them to be able to dictate the policy over such a vast majority who favor. There were a lot of debates over a lot of issues, Ukraine, of course, among them. And the thing that they were able to get done was a clean continuing resolution, no special supplemental funding or anything. And remember that Ukraine is supplemental, it's not part of the regular budget. So they had to do that just to keep the government running without any additional elements in there. Now they have time to pick a new speaker. They have to deal with the further continuing resolutions or budget that will come basically beginning in mid-November. And then I think they will come back to the question of Ukraine aid.
Concerning the actual support for Ukraine and why it matters, President Biden is planning to speak to the American people at some point to lay out why he believes support for Ukraine is in our own national security interests. Obviously, support is still there for Ukraine, but it's, in recent polls, seems to be slipping a bit. What do you think the president needs to say, and why is aid to Ukraine so fundamental to American national security interests?
Right. Well, first off, it's great that the president is coming out to give a speech like that. In fact, I would say it's long overdue. We've been spending a lot of money. We've been engaged in this effort to help Ukraine for well over a year. And this is the first time that the president is coming out to address the American people this way. I think what he needs to say is that it is an American interest to see Ukraine succeed and Russian forces defeated. It's not only about charity, it's about serving our own interests. And the reason that it's an American interest is because Vladimir Putin is now on the goal, on the program of trying to rebuild the Russian Empire, to take territory in Europe that does not belong to Russia in order to rebuild a sense of empire. And the risk is that he will do this with other countries that are now NATO members, countries that were in the Russian Empire previously or the Soviet Union previously, that he may now want to take back. This could include the Baltic states, which are members of NATO, could include Finland. He is threatening the security of Europe as a whole. If he does attack a NATO member or widen the war, it will draw the U.S. into it directly. And we certainly don't want to be forced into that position. And we're far better off if his forces are actually defeated in Ukraine, and then we see some kind of acceptance by Russia to live within its own borders.
And do you think it would be better for us to just give them the support they need to just conquer this, or to continue to give it in doses?
Yeah, I think the drip-by-drip approach that we've used has been very damaging. It has drawn out the war. It has caused greater loss of life. It has given the Russians time to build these massive defenses in the south that they have built. And it has contributed to the sense of fatigue or the sense of questioning, how long is this going to go on, which is making it harder to pass additional aid in the House. So I think we do have to lift the restrictions, give them the weapons that we would want if we were going to be doing this so that they are able to do it themselves.
With the U.S. now focused on Israel and the world watching what's happening in Israel, that's something Congress is also going to need to take up. Will that change the equation at all as far as Congress and the Americans, for that matter, willing to support Ukraine? Will that sort of shift the focus or take a priority?
Well, it's certainly going to grab the headlines for a while now. The attacks against Israel are absolutely horrific. And of course, Israel is now going to fight back, and that will grab attention. But ultimately, I think what we see is that these are two sides of the same coin. You have, in one case, Hamas, in another case, Russia, engaging in terrorist attacks, deliberate targeting of civilians, really something that no one can accept. And I think as we look at the way that Israel is fighting back, as it must, I think we have to realize that Ukraine needs to fight back as well. They're just up against a much more powerful adversary.
Ambassador Kurt Volker, a distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, who also served as U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations from 2017 to 2019 and as the former U.S. Ambassador to NATO. With divisions growing from Western allies, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Monday spoke to NATO's Parliamentary Assembly and called for Western unity in the face of global events.
This is not the time to withdraw from the international arena into internal disputes. This is not the time to isolate ourselves. This is not the time to remain silent or pretend that terror on one continent does not affect global affairs. Everyone can help prevent the chasm between the world and peace from wide.
He also expressed gratitude for the defense support allies have provided, while stressing the need to continue for the sake of all.
And I thank all of you who are working with us to implement the peace formula. All areas of our cooperation lead to one thing: to ensure that the UN Charter is fully effective in protecting Ukraine and our entire Europe from terror and aggression. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge your states and parliaments to be even more active for the sake of global unity. Let everyone who sponsors terror feel the power of our rest. And let everyone who needs help defending themselves against terror feel the power of our solidarity. We must all be able to promise our children that we will leave them a world ruled not by blood shed by evil, but by freedom guaranteed by law.
Meanwhile, Russia may be paving the way to conduct a nuclear test, a move that would sharply raise tensions with the West and likely prompt other world powers to resume testing for the first time this century. President Vladimir Putin last week said Russia's parliament should consider withdrawing Moscow's ratification of the 1996 Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which prohibits tests involving nuclear explosions. Parliamentary leaders were due to discuss the issue on Monday. You're listening to VOA's Flashpoint Ukraine. I'm Lori London. Russia's government said on Friday it had lifted a ban on pipeline diesel exports via ports, removing the bulk of restrictions installed on September 21st. Francis McGuire with Reuters reports.
Russia lifted a ban on pipeline diesel exports through ports on Friday. It removes the majority of restrictions put in place last month in a bid to tackle shortages and stem rising prices. The move will force markets to take notice, as Russia is the world's top seaborne exporter of diesel. The fuel is also Russia's biggest oil export at about 35 million tons last year. Almost 3/4 of that was shipped via pipelines. Restrictions on fuel exports from the country have raised global prices and forced some buyers to find other sources of gasoline and diesel. Russia has fought shortages and high fuel prices in recent months, and that's especially hurt farmers during the harvesting season. Since the ban was introduced, wholesale diesel prices on the local exchange have fallen by 21%, while gasoline prices are down by 1/10. Even though rules have eased for diesel, gasoline exports still have restrictions in place. Russia exported 4.8 million tons of gasoline in 2022.
Francis McGuire reporting for Reuters. With the war now in its second year, the humanitarian needs resulting from Russia's invasion of Ukraine are continuing to mount. I spoke with Achille Dupre, spokesperson for the International Committee of the Red Cross in Ukraine.
What we're seeing is that, as you said, it's something that has been going on for over 18 months, that this armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia is going on, and this is taking such a heavy toll on civilians and on civilian infrastructure. And that highlights something that for us as the Red Cross is so unacceptable. It's the fact that civilians should not be the ones suffering from armed conflict. As according to international humanitarian law, according to the Geneva Conventions, civilian infrastructures should be protected, and the belligerents must take all protections to spare them. And unfortunately, we see so often that this is sadly not the case. And when this isn't the case, it means that we see just shocking and appalling levels of loss of civilian lives. It's just communities that have been suffering for months because they live close to the front line, because sometimes the front line is moving closer to them. Sometimes they are from remote communities where it's really difficult for a humanitarian organization to access them, and they're the ones suffering the most. And so it's just very shocking and appalling, really.
You're saying it's really difficult the way they're living and the infrastructure. Can you be specific about how they are living? Are they living in bomb shelters? What about the homes and schools and all that?
So the thing that we have to understand is that these communities living very close to the front line, sometimes they have seen literally their villages become the front line. So they have had to live sometimes for weeks underground in shelter. winter, even when their village isn't stricto sensu the front line itself, it means that they're seeing aerial strikes that are going above their heads. Obviously, this takes a toll also on their mental health, on their psychological well-being. So the way they're living is that a lot of these communities, if you're so close to the front line, most people who were in a position to leave, they have left. So this means that the ones that are remaining are typically some of the most vulnerable. For example, the elderly or people with disabilities or children. So they're living in very, very dire conditions. And it's so important that humanitarian organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross or also our partners of the Ukrainian Red Cross are able to go in these communities regularly and bring them the essentials, really, water, food, hygiene products. And also now the temperatures are getting quite cold already in Ukraine, but it's going to get much worse in the winter. So all these communities, they're already preparing for the winter. They're repairing their houses when they have been damaged. They have to redo insulation of their houses. So all of these things that need to be done before it gets too cold. So they're really living in very dire conditions.
And so you guys are actually going into these communities and bringing emergency assistance to the people living in the conflict zones or are displaced? Are we talking about food, medical? Are you providing housing? How does that all work as far as helping these people find a way to survive through all of this?
So for us, our main focus is on bringing humanitarian relief to people who are close to the front line because they're the ones that are the most vulnerable and the most affected. What we bring them can be drinking water when they need it. Also, one very important thing is that we come to these communities and we bring repair materials that we donate to these communities so that they can repair, for example, their windows that have been shattered, or they can repair the roofs that have been destroyed. So all these things that make it so that they can keep on living as normal a life as possible in these circumstances. We are also going to these communities to help the local authorities because the local authorities are always operating. So we're supporting, for example, the medical infrastructure, the health facilities. We're giving them war-wounded kids to treat injuries from missile strikes, this sort of thing. So we are really helping people directly so that they can sustain a living, but also we're helping the authorities around them that are doing everything possible for life to continue in these terribly difficult circumstances.
How many staffers do you have on the ground in Ukraine?
For us, for the International Committee of the Red Cross, our humanitarian response in Ukraine is our largest operation globally. We have a workforce of around 800 staff, a bit under that, across the country. So that means that we have staff that goes very regularly to all the communities that need humanitarian assistance all across the country. The front line is extremely long, so we have several offices with colleagues going into the communities. Sometimes it's hard to reach communities because the roads are very difficult. So we are working also hand in hand with our partners from the Ukrainian Red Cross, and they have thousands of volunteers across the country. And they're also helping us tremendously in reaching the people that need us to reach them.
Sounds like the needs are extremely intense for food and drinking water. And you mentioned mental health. Obviously, this has obviously taken a serious toll on the mental health of the people of Ukraine. You guys are also addressing that issue, aren't you?
Absolutely. In Ukraine, as in any other country that is affected by armed conflict, of course, you see first the visible scars, the people that are injured, the physical injury. What people often don't see is the mental health toll that it takes on regular people, including children.
All right. Well, we thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about all of these important aspects of this ongoing war that continues to devastate the people of Ukraine.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity. It's always a pleasure to speak to you, Laura.
Akhil Dupre, spokesperson for the International Committee of the Red Cross in Ukraine. Thank you so much for speaking with us. The head of the UN Refugee Agency, meanwhile, said Monday the organization was facing one of the most difficult moments in its more than 70-year history, with some 110 million people displaced around the world and a major funding shortfall.
Given this backdrop, I'm extremely worried about the underfunding of UNHCR and, broadly speaking, humanitarian operations. More worried than I have been in almost 8 years in which I have held this office.
In an address to the UNHCR's governing body, Filippo Grandi urged countries to respect the rights of those fleeing conflict or persecution guaranteed under the 1951 Refugee Convention the body was created to oversee. Conflicts from Ukraine to Sudan have pushed displacements to record levels around the globe at a time when some governments face growing pressure to get tougher on asylum seekers. And that'll do it for us today. Stay up to date with continuing coverage on Ukraine and news from around the world 24 hours a day at voanews.com. And on social media, just follow VOA News. On behalf of all of us here at VOA, we thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm VOA's Lori London.
This is the voice of America. Washington, D.C.
Coming up on the show today, the death toll in Israel and Gaza continues to rise.
The bodies of more than 260 young music festival goers were discovered Sunday.
Plus, the geopolitics of Saturday's attack.
Decisions to engage in war by these groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, and others can only happen with explicit prior direct agreement from Iran.
And later, we're in New York City for a rally in support of Palestinians in Times Square and a rally for Israel on the East Side, and a look at what to do with some 350 luxury vehicles in Gabon. Today is Tuesday, October 10th, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. We'll take a look at some of the larger geopolitical implications of Saturday's invasion of Israel by Hamas. But first, an update on the fighting. Israel has announced a complete siege of Gaza. That means it'll cut off food, water, and electricity. The death toll in both Israel and Gaza continues to climb as fighting continues for a third day. Linda Gradstein reports from Jerusalem.
Palestinian health officials said several dozen Palestinians, including women and children, were killed in an Israeli airstrike on the Jabalia refugee camp Monday in Gaza. The health officials said more than 500 people had been killed and 120,000 had fled their homes to schools and other areas of Gaza. Ibrahim Nofal is a resident of Jabalia.
More than 4 homes in the Al-Trans area in Jabalia were destroyed without warning. More than 50 or 60 martyrs, a lot of casualties, unbelievable devastation. Oh my God, they are pulling out people now. Oh my God.
In Israel, the country remains in shock over the largest death toll in 50 years. The bodies of more than 260 young music festival goers were discovered Sunday. Hamas gunmen kidnapped more than 130 Israelis, many from the festival, and took them to Gaza. One of those missing is 21-year-old Adi Maisel. Her mother, Ahuva Maisel, spoke to journalists Monday.
It was our last call in which we heard a lot of noises and shootings and bombing and chaos, total chaos. And that was our last call with Adi. And since then, we have no exact, accurate